My daughter-in-law called me a burden 14 times before I finally decided to make her regret ever counting. Not with my fists, not with my voice raised above a whisper, but with a single phone call to a man who owed me a favor from 30 years ago. I let her humiliate me in front of her sister's entire wedding party, in front of her book club, in front of the mailman, and I wrote every single one of those moments down on a legal pad I kept hidden inside my tackle box. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story earns it. My name is Walter. I'm 68 years old, and for 35 years I ran a small fleet of tow trucks out of a gravel lot in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I built that business from a single flatbed I bought with money I saved working double shifts at a steel fabrication plant. My hands are cracked and my back aches most mornings before the coffee even finishes brewing, but I never once complained, because complaining wasn't something my father raised me to do. I raised my daughter Claire the same way. Humble, grateful, aware that nothing in this life gets handed to you. Claire married a man named Derek 9 years ago. Derek sold insurance for a regional company and had a talent for sounding important in rooms where nobody checked his numbers. When Claire's husband before Derek, her college sweetheart, died suddenly of a heart condition at 31, Claire was left with a mortgage, 2 young kids, and a grief that nearly swallowed her whole. I helped her through it the only way I knew how. I paid off that mortgage in full, quietly, through a small holding company I'd set up years earlier for tax purposes. Nobody knew, not even Claire. As far as she and Derek were concerned, the house on Larkspur Lane simply belonged to her, free and clear, a gift from a dead husband's life insurance policy that in reality had barely covered the funeral. I never told her the truth, because I didn't want her to feel indebted to me. I wanted her to feel safe. That was my mistake. Safety, when it isn't earned, sometimes curdles into entitlement. And entitlement, when nobody challenges it, grows into something uglier. Derek moved into that house 3 years after Claire's first husband passed. I welcomed him. I helped him get his insurance license renewed after he let it lapse. I co-signed the loan on his Ford F-250 when his credit was too thin for the dealership to approve him a loan. When his mother's health failed, I drove 4 hours each way, twice a month, so she could see her grandchildren before she passed. I did all of this because that's what family does. I never once asked for gratitude. I only asked, eventually, for a small favor in return, a place to stay in the finished basement of the Larkspur Lane house, after my knees got too bad to keep managing my own property alone, and after the loneliness of an empty house finally became too heavy to carry by myself. Derek agreed, but only because Claire insisted, and only after negotiating what he called reasonable terms. I would pay $400 a month toward utilities. I would keep to the basement unless invited upstairs. I would not, under any circumstances, make things awkward when his colleagues from the insurance office came over for what he liked to call his quarterly appreciation dinners. I moved in on a rainy Tuesday in March with 2 suitcases and a box of tools. I told myself it was temporary, a soft landing until I figured out my next chapter. I did not know then that I was walking into the quietest, most calculated humiliation of my life, delivered one small cruelty at a time by a woman I had once carried on my shoulders through a county fair, laughing so hard she nearly lost her shoe in the mud. The first slight came within a week. I was down in the basement fixing a leaking pipe under the laundry sink when Claire came down the stairs in her robe, arms crossed, phone pressed between her shoulder and her ear. She didn't even look at me directly. She just said, loud enough for whoever was on the other end of that call to hear clearly, "It's fine. It's just my dad living down here temporarily. Don't worry about the noise. He tinkers with stuff constantly. It's kind of embarrassing, honestly. But what can you do?" I froze under that sink, wrench in hand, listening to my own daughter describe me to a stranger as an embarrassment. I didn't say a word. I finished tightening the fitting, wiped my hands on my jeans, and went back to reading my newspaper in the corner of that basement that had slowly become my entire world. That was strike one. I did not call them slaps like some men might. I called them debts. Every single unkindness went into a column in my head. And I promised myself that someday, every debt would be repaid in full, with interest. Derek's insurance office held its holiday party at the house that December, the kind of gathering where junior agents wear their one good blazer and senior partners drink top-shelf bourbon out of plastic cups because nobody trusts the good glassware around 30 tipsy salespeople. Derek asked me 3 days beforehand if I would mind helping out a little during the party. I said, of course, thinking I'd carry some folding chairs, maybe man the grill. Instead, on the night of the party, Derek handed me a red polo shirt, 2 sizes too small, and asked me to stand by the coat closet near the front door, taking jackets from guests as they arrived. Just for the first hour, while people are coming in, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. It looks more organized if someone's handling the coats. You don't mind, right? Since you're not really doing much else these days? I put on the shirt, the sleeves cut into my arms. I stood by that closet for 2.5 hours, not one, taking wool coats and cashmere scarves from people half my age who called me sir without ever asking my name. One woman, a senior agent named Patrice, handed me her coat and said to the man beside her, not bothering to lower her voice, Derek's got his father-in-law working the door now. That's a new level of thrifty. They both laughed. I hung her coat carefully on a wooden hanger and said nothing. Debt number 2. My hands were steady, but something inside my chest had gone very still and very cold. Later that same night, I was refilling the ice bucket in the kitchen when I overheard Derek on the back patio, laughing with 2 colleagues, a cigar between his fingers. Yeah, that's my father-in-law working the door tonight, he was saying. Poor guy's basically living in my basement rent-free at this point. I mean, we charge him something, but it's basically charity. What can you do, right? You take care of family even when they can't really take care of themselves anymore. Rent-free, charity, can't take care of himself anymore. I stood in that kitchen with an ice bucket sweating in my hands, listening to my son-in-law rewrite the truth of my life for an audience of strangers. And I understood something clearly for the first time. To Derek, I wasn't a father who had quietly paid off his house. I was a prop, a convenient story he told to make himself look generous. Debt number 3. I set the ice bucket down gently so it wouldn't make a sound, and I walked outside into the cold and stood by myself near the fence line until my breathing slowed. The months that followed brought debts 4 through 9 in a steady, grinding rhythm. Claire asked me to park my truck around the block whenever guests were expected, because my old Chevy, she said, kind of brings down the whole street's vibe. Derek referred to my bedroom, a converted storage room, as the utility closet in front of his brother. When my arthritis flared badly enough that I dropped a casserole dish at Thanksgiving, Claire snapped at me in front of both her children, telling me to be more careful because we can't afford to keep replacing things you break. Derek once introduced me to a new neighbor as Claire's dad. He's staying with us while he gets back on his feet, as though I were a man recovering from bankruptcy rather than a man who had quietly written a check that erased their mortgage entirely. Debt 10 came from my own grandchildren, though I never blamed them, not truly, because children learn cruelty by watching the adults around them practice it first. My grandson Tyler, 11 years old, asked me one evening why I didn't have my own house like other grandpas. Before I could answer gently, Claire cut in from the kitchen doorway. Grandpa had some money troubles a while back, sweetheart. That's why he lives with us now. We're helping him. I looked at her, waiting for the correction, waiting for even a flicker of the truth to cross her face. It never came. She believed her own story completely because believing it made her generosity feel real and made my continued presence feel like an act of charity rather than what it actually was repayment for a debt she didn't even know existed. Debt 11 happened at Claire's sister's wedding that spring, a lavish affair at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city. I wore my one good suit, pressed carefully the night before. I was seated, without explanation, at a table near the kitchen doors, far from the family section, alongside 2 elderly great-aunts I had never met. When I asked Claire about it quietly before the ceremony, she waved her hand dismissively. It's just easier this way, Dad. The main tables are for people who are more, part of the immediate picture. Don't make a thing of it. More part of the immediate picture. I sat through an entire wedding reception being served last, addressed by waitstaff who assumed I was someone's elderly uncle, while my daughter danced beneath string lights with a man who had once asked me, quite seriously, whether I'd ever consider contributing a bit more toward groceries. Debt 12 was smaller but somehow sharper than all the others. Claire's book club met at the house one Tuesday evening. I came upstairs quietly to get a glass of water, careful not to intrude. One of the women, someone I'd never met, glanced at me and asked Claire, in a voice pitched for sympathy, "Is that your father? Bless his heart. It must be so hard having him around all the time now." Claire sighed theatrically and said, "You have no idea. It's honestly like having a third child some days, except this one doesn't grow up." The women laughed softly. The kind of laugh people give when they think they're being compassionate rather than cruel. I filled my glass of water at the sink 12 feet away and listened to every word. Det 13 was the mailman, of all people. A young fellow named Ronnie who delivered our street every weekday. Claire had apparently told him, in passing, that I struggled with confusion sometimes, and asked him to always confirm packages with her directly rather than leaving them with me, just to be safe. Ronnie, kind soul that he was, started speaking to me slowly and loudly, the way you'd address a man who couldn't be trusted to sign his own name. I signed contracts worth more than that entire house when I was running my fleet. I understood exactly what my daughter had done. She hadn't just diminished me in front of her friends and her husband's colleagues. She had begun quietly rewriting me into a man who needed managing, a man whose judgment could not be trusted, laying groundwork I didn't yet understand the purpose of. Det 14 arrived on a Sunday afternoon in October, and it was the one that finally broke something loose in my chest that had been holding steady for 8 long months. I was in the basement, going through an old shoebox of photographs, pictures of Claire as a little girl, missing her front teeth, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair, both of us laughing at something lost to memory now. I heard raised voices upstairs and climbed the stairs quietly, worried something was wrong. Derek was on a video call in the living room with 2 men I recognized from his office, discussing what sounded like a major sales incentive trip to Cancun, contingent on hitting quarterly numbers. Claire stood beside him, refilling his coffee, playing the supportive wife. One of the men on the screen asked, almost as an afterthought, "Hey, didn't you mention your father-in-law used to run some kind of business? Family money in there anywhere that could help float you past this quarter if things get tight?" Derek laughed, waving the question away. "Oh, no. Whatever he had, he burned through it years ago. He's basically living off us at this point. It's actually kind of sad, honestly. Used to run some little tow truck outfit, small potatoes, nothing that ever amounted to much. We just try to make sure he's comfortable in his last years, you know? Take care of the people who couldn't take care of themselves. Small potatoes. Nothing that ever amounted to much. Couldn't take care of himself." I stood on the 3rd step from the top, out of view, and felt something inside my chest go perfectly, absolutely still. Not angry. Angrier than angry. Clear. For 8 months, I had absorbed every small cruelty as the price of staying close to my daughter and my grandchildren. But this was different. This wasn't Derek mocking me for his own amusement. This was Derek erasing 35 years of my life, my labor, my sacrifice, and repackaging it as failure in order to make himself look magnanimous in front of men he was trying to impress. I did not storm into that living room. I did not confront him. I turned around, walked quietly back down into the basement, and sat down at the small desk in the corner where I kept my old laptop, the one Derek had once joked was older than the internet itself. I opened a folder I hadn't touched in over a year. Inside it were scanned copies of every document related to Larkspur Lane, the original purchase agreement, the payoff letter from the mortgage company, the deed showing the property held in trust under Cobalt Ridge Holdings, a company I had quietly controlled since before Claire's first husband had even passed away. Derek didn't know Cobalt Ridge existed. Claire didn't know it existed. As far as either of them understood, the house belonged to Claire outright, unencumbered, a gift from a policy payout that had never actually covered a fraction of what that house was worth. I picked up my phone and called a man named Harold Pruitt, an attorney I'd known since we were both 26 years old, back when he handled the paperwork for my very first tow truck purchase. Harold had retired from his firm but still took cases for men he considered friends, and I was one of the very few he still called that. "Walter," he said, picking up on the second ring, sounding pleased and a little surprised. "It's been a while. Everything all right?" "No," I told him, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "But it's about to be. I need you to listen carefully, Harold, because I'm only going to walk through this once." I laid it all out for him with the same clean precision I once used to quote a job to a customer. No wasted words, no emotion clouding the facts. I told him about the basement, the polo shirt, the wedding table by the kitchen, the mailman who now spoke to me like a child. I told him what I'd overheard on that video call, word for word, as close as I could remember it. Harold was quiet for a long moment. "Walter, that house is legally yours. It's held under Cobalt Ridge. You could have Claire and Derek out of there inside 60 days if you wanted to, and there wouldn't be a single thing either of them could do about it." "I know," I said. "I've known for a year and a half. I just never wanted to use it." "What changed?" I looked up at the low basement ceiling, at the water stain shaped like Ohio that I'd been meaning to fix for months. I stopped being invisible to myself tonight, Harold. That's what changed. I want to start the process. Quietly. I don't want a scene. I want it handled the way you'd handle a hostile buyout, clean, complete, and impossible to reverse once it starts. Harold exhaled slowly. You understand what this means for Claire. Not just Derek. I understood exactly what it meant. That was the part that kept me sitting in that basement long after I hung up the phone, staring at that shoebox of photographs, my chest aching with something far more complicated than anger. My daughter had absorbed her husband's cruelty as easily as breathing, had repeated his lies about me to her own children, had let 8 months of small humiliations pass without ever once defending the father who had quietly erased her mortgage out of love. But underneath all of that was still the little girl on my shoulders at the county fair, laughing so hard she nearly lost her shoe. I wasn't punishing that girl. I was answering the woman she had allowed herself to become, and the man who had taught her that cruelty toward me was simply the cost of doing business. Do it, Harold, I said finally. Start Monday morning. Harold moved fast, the way he always had. Over the following 2 weeks, while I continued sleeping in that basement, continued taking coats at another one of Derek's office gatherings, continued absorbing small cruelties with a calm face that gave away nothing, Harold quietly prepared the paperwork to formally activate Cobalt Ridge Holdings' ownership rights. He arranged for the property to be transferred to a private buyer, a retired colleague of his named Grant Whitfield, who ran a small portfolio of residential rental properties and had cash ready to close within days. No financing contingencies, no delays. The timing came together almost by accident. The kind of gift you don't ask for but recognize instantly when it lands in your lap. Derek's company was sending him and Claire on that incentive trip to Cancun. After all, a 4-day conference for top-performing agents and their spouses. They would be gone Thursday through Sunday. My grandchildren would be staying with Derek's mother's sister 2 towns over. The house would be completely empty for 4 full days. I told Claire the week before they left that I planned to visit an old army buddy in Harrisburg for a few days while they were gone, just to have some peace and quiet. She barely looked up from her suitcase. That's fine, Dad. Just make sure the basement door is locked when you go. Make sure the basement door's locked. As if I were a stranger they were tolerating rather than the man who owned every square foot of that property. The morning they left, I stood at the living room window and watched Derek load their suitcases into the trunk of his Ford Explorer, laughing at something on his phone, completely unaware that he was walking toward the last morning he would ever spend as the man of that house. Claire hugged me briefly at the door, told me to eat something other than sandwiches while she was gone, and climbed into the passenger seat without a backward glance. I watched their taillights disappear around the corner of Larkspur Lane, and I felt the cold clarity I'd been carrying for 2 weeks harden into something unshakable. I called Harold the moment their car turned onto the main road. They're gone, I said. 4 days, go. What followed happened with a precision that still, looking back, feels almost surgical. Grant Whitfield's team arrived within 3 hours, moving trucks and all, professional and quiet, the way Harold had promised. I stood in the driveway and gave them clear instructions. The same instructions I'd give any crew working a job site: pack everything with care, damage nothing, box every item as though it belonged to someone you respected, because that was the only line I refused to cross. I wasn't interested in destruction. I wanted precision. I wanted them to understand, without a single object broken or scratched, exactly how completely their illusion of ownership had always rested on a foundation they never actually controlled. I walked through that house one final time as the movers worked around me, watching 4 decades of my own quiet sacrifice get boxed up and carted out the door. In Claire's jewelry box, resting carelessly among costume pieces, I found a gold locket that had belonged to my late wife, Eleanor. A locket I had given Claire on her 16th birthday, containing a small photograph of the mother she'd lost too young. Claire had apparently forgotten it was even there, buried under bracelets she wore far more often. I slipped it into my shirt pocket, the only thing in that entire house I claimed as mine to take, because Eleanor would have wanted it with me, not lost among trinkets in a house about to belong to someone else entirely. Every stitch of Derek's tailored clothing, every piece of Claire's furniture, every dish and lamp and framed photograph was packed with meticulous care into a climate-controlled storage facility 15 minutes away, the unit rented for exactly 30 days under my name, with Derek listed as an authorized contact but denied physical access. I would not let anyone say I destroyed what didn't need destroying. I only intended to make it unreachable, which felt, somehow, like a far heavier sentence. By Saturday evening, the house stood completely empty. New locks, keyless digital entry systems, replaced every door in the house within hours, installed by a security company Grant Whitfield's people brought with them. I stood in the driveway as the final truck pulled away, looking up at the house where I had spent 8 months being called an embarrassment, a burden, small potatoes, a man who couldn't take care of himself. The porch light glowed above a door that no longer had a keyhole Derek's key could touch. I drove back to a small extended-stay motel off Route 6, the same one I'd told Claire I'd be staying at near my army buddy's place, which had at least been half true. Harold had booked the room himself, and I spent those 4 days sleeping better than I had in 8 months. Sunday evening arrived cold and clear. I drove back to Larkspur Lane just before 7, parking my old Chevy across the street, engine off, watching. Right on schedule, the Ford Explorer turned onto the block, headlights sweeping across the darkened front lawn. I watched Derek pull into the driveway, watched him climb out, still tan from 4 days by a resort pool, watched him grab their suitcases from the trunk, while Claire checked her phone under the porch light. Derek walked up to the front door, keys already in hand, still talking loudly about something from the conference, some award he'd apparently won for top sales numbers in his region. He reached for the door handle and stopped cold. The brass handle he'd turned 1,000 times was gone, replaced by a smooth black keypad glowing faintly red in the darkness. He tried his key anyway, jabbing it uselessly against a lock that no longer existed for him. He knocked, then pounded, calling my name, assuming. The way people like Derek always assume, that whatever was wrong must somehow be my fault. Must be some confusion, some mistake made by poor Walter, who apparently couldn't be trusted to manage anything correctly anymore. Claire came up behind him, suitcase rolling across the driveway. "What's going on? Why isn't the door opening?" That's when I stepped out of my truck. I walked across the street slowly, unhurried, the cold October air settling into my joints the way it always did this time of year. Though for the first time in 8 months, I didn't feel the need to hide the ache, didn't feel the need to perform weakness or strength for anyone's benefit. I was simply a man walking toward his daughter, carrying a manila folder under one arm. Derek spun around when he heard my footsteps on the pavement, his face flushing with the particular fury of a man who has never once been told no. "Walter, what did you do? Did you call a locksmith? Is this some kind of joke? Get the guy back out here right now. We've been traveling for 6 hours and I am not in the mood." I stopped a few feet from them both, close enough to see the confusion still fighting for space against the anger on Claire's face. I held the folder out toward her, not toward Derek, because this conversation, more than anything else, needed to happen between a father and his daughter. "Open it," I said quietly. My voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken in 2 weeks. Claire took the folder with hands that trembled slightly, the cold and the confusion working together against her composure. She opened it under the glow of the porch light. The first page was the original deed, listing Cobalt Ridge Holdings as sole owner since the very week her first husband's funeral had been paid for. The second page was the payoff letter from the mortgage company, dated more than 6 years earlier, showing a balance of zero, paid in full by a company she'd never heard of, controlled entirely by a man standing 3 feet in front of her. I watched her read it. I watched the exact moment the truth landed, not just the truth of who owned the house, but the truth underneath that truth, the fact that she had spent 9 years believing a story about her own life that had never once been accurate, and that the story she'd told her children about their grandfather's failures had been, this entire time, a lie built on top of my silence. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't understand. It says I paid off your house 6 years ago," I said, "and never told you because I didn't want you carrying the weight of owing me anything. I wanted you to feel safe. I never once needed thanks for it, Claire. All I ever needed was to not be treated like garbage in the house I quietly gave you." Derek grabbed at the folder, flipping to the final page with shaking hands, his tan face draining to a color closer to ash under the porch light. It was Harold's formal letter, detailing the sale of the property to Grant Whitfield, effective as of Friday morning, along with an itemized invoice for 8 months of accumulated back rent at fair market value, plus the cost of the extraction and storage, a figure that landed somewhere north of $90,000, a debt now legally owed to Cobalt Ridge Holdings. "You can't do this," Derek said. his voice climbing into a register I'd never heard from him before, something closer to panic than anger now. This is illegal. This is our house. We've lived here for 6 years. You've lived here for 6 years in a house you never once paid a mortgage on, I said, my voice still level, still calm, still the same voice I'd used for 35 years, quoting jobs to customers who tried to talk me down on price. A house you told your colleagues I couldn't afford to contribute to, a house where you had your wife tell the mailman I couldn't be trusted to sign for my own packages. A house where I stood by your front door in a shirt 2 sizes too small, taking coats from people who called me sir because nobody bothered to tell them my name. Derek opened his mouth, then closed it, the folder shaking in his hands. Where's the locket? Claire asked suddenly, her hand flying to her throat, to the place where she must have realized the small gold chain no longer sat among the jewelry she'd packed for the trip. Dad, where is Mom's locket? I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled it out, the small gold locket catching the porch light, and held it out toward her on my open palm. This is the only thing I took from that house, Claire. Because it was never yours to lose carelessly among costume jewelry you barely remembered you owned. Everything else, every dish, every suit, every piece of furniture, is sitting safely in a storage unit 15 minutes from here, packed with more care than either of you ever showed me in 8 months. Nothing is broken. Nothing is missing. I am not a cruel man. I am simply a man who finally stopped being invisible. Claire took the locket from my palm, closing her fingers around it, tears finally spilling over and running down her face in the cold night air. I didn't know, she said, her voice cracking completely now. Dad, I swear I didn't know any of this. I thought Derek always said, I know what Derek always said, I told her, and for the first time that night, I let something softer creep into my voice. Because underneath everything, underneath 8 months of debts collected and finally repaid, she was still my daughter, and some part of this had never been about punishing her specifically. I heard what he said about me on that video call, Claire. Small potatoes, couldn't take care of himself. I heard you tell your book club I was like a third child who never grows up. I heard every single word for 8 months, and I wrote every single one of them down. Derek finally found his voice again, though it came out smaller now, stripped of its usual confident polish. Walter, please listen, we can figure this out. I didn't mean any of that stuff. That's just how guys talk at those things. It means exactly what it sounds like it means, I said, cutting him off without raising my voice even slightly. And it's going to mean something very specific to your regional office too, because that video call you had 2 weeks ago, discussing whether family money might help you make quarterly numbers, is now part of a formal complaint Harold has filed regarding fraudulent representations you've made about your financial obligations, given that you have been reporting this house as a personal asset on loan applications for the last 4 years, a house you never once owned. The color completely left Derek's face. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, no sound coming out at all. I turned back to Claire, softening my voice just slightly, because this next part needed to be said gently, even though it needed to be said firmly. You have 30 days to retrieve everything from that storage unit, free of charge, no questions asked. That part isn't a punishment. That part is still love, even now. But this house belongs to someone else as of Friday morning, and it is never coming back to either of you. What you do with your marriage after tonight, Claire, is entirely your own business. I've buried enough of my own pride these last 8 months to know better than to bury anyone else's choices for them. I looked at Derek one final time, at the man standing frozen on a porch that no longer belonged to him, still holding suitcases full of vacation clothes he'd worn to celebrate sales numbers, built partly on lies about a father-in-law he'd never bothered to actually know. You called me small potatoes in front of your colleagues, I said quietly. I hope Cancun was worth it. I turned and walked back across the street to my truck, my knees aching in the familiar way they always did this time of year, my chest lighter than it had felt in 8 long months. I climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb without looking back, leaving my daughter standing in the cold beside a suitcase and a locket, and leaving her husband standing beside a door that would never again open for him. The months that followed unfolded exactly the way these things tend to, once the truth finally gets loose. Derek's company opened a formal review into his loan disclosures within weeks, and though he wasn't criminally charged, he lost his position by spring, quietly pushed out under circumstances. His former colleagues discussed only in whispers. Claire moved out of a rented apartment near her sister's place, filed for divorce in February, and started working part-time at a physical therapy office while finishing the associate's degree she'd abandoned years earlier when she married her first husband. She calls me most Sundays now. Sometimes we talk for an hour. Sometimes we just sit on the phone in comfortable silence while my grandchildren tell me about their week in the background. She has never once asked me to reverse anything, and I have never once offered. Some debts, once repaid, are meant to stay settled. As for me, I used a portion of the sale proceeds to buy a small cabin on a quiet lake 2 hours north. Nothing fancy, just 4 rooms and a porch that faces the water. I sit out there most mornings now with a cup of coffee, watching the mist come off the lake, my knees still aching the way they always will, but my chest finally quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. I don't regret what I did. I regret only that it took 8 months of small cruelties, stacked one on top of another, before I finally understood that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just an invitation for people to see how far they can push before you finally stop absorbing the damage and start setting the terms. Yourself. If this story meant something to you tonight, if you've ever swallowed your pride to keep peace with people who never once extended you the same courtesy, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.